Welcome to the fourth lecture of the 2020 Biomedical Research Integrity, or BRI, Summer Lecture Series. My name is Karen Peterson. I'm the Scientific Ombuds and the Director of the Office of Scientific Career Development at the Fred Hutch. I co-direct the BRI program with my colleague Malia Fullerton of the University of Washington. We're assisted in our work on the UW side by Melissa Cox and Angel Inquanta of the Department of Bioethics and Humanities, and on the Fred Hutch side by Amber Ismail of the Office of Scientific Career Development. As most of you are aware, the Federal Public Health Service and its research institutions require that all pre- and postdoctoral researchers supported by PHS training grants receive training in the responsible conduct of research. In addition, the Fred Hutch requires all of its pre- and postdoctoral researchers to receive this training. The UW and Fred Hutch have developed this program of lectures and discussion groups for its researchers to meet this requirement. So just a few bits of housekeeping before we get started. This is, of course, our first year with a completely virtual program, and you must register in order to receive the Zoom link. Note, if you're registered through RedCap in one email and in Zoom with a different email, you might not receive credit. Please use the same email for both. The link you receive is your link. Please don't share it with others because they will not receive credit for attending by using your link. If you cannot attend the lecture live, each lecture will be recorded and posted approximately 24 hours after its live delivery. You'll need to view the lecture and take the corresponding short quiz before you receive credit for attendance. For attending the UW-based discussion groups, it's also a great idea to watch or review the lecture linked to each discussion section before you attend. We're using the Zoom webinar feature that allows audience attendees to submit questions using the Q&A box at the bottom. You'll see the Q&A and the chat box. Please just use the Q&A box. You may do so either as an identified participant, or you may also submit questions anonymously if you choose. So other audience members can upvote your questions. So if you are a participant and you read through the questions and you like one, you can click the little thumbs up and it will rise up to the top of the list. Please don't forget to complete the post-lecture evaluation that was sent to you in your registration confirmation email. This is the primary way by which we can tell that you have attended and engaged with the lecture material. So with the housekeeping taken care of, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sharona Gordon, who's our speaker today. Dr. Gordon is Professor of Physiology and Biophysics and Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Education in the UW School of Medicine. She is Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of General Physiology, has significant local and international leadership experience, and has developed mentoring programs for early career scientists. Dr. Gordon has contributed extensively to scholarship on the culture of academic science, women in science, and the relationship between science publishing and community activism. One of the many programs she has founded is Below the Waterline, a grassroots organization working to implement the recommendations of the National Academy's report on sexual harassment. Dr. Gordon will be speaking today on themes related to the PHS required topic of conflict of interest, with the title of her talk being Conflict of Interest, Competition and Cooperation in Science. Sharona.
Thank you so much, Karen, and also Malia for inviting me. Last year, when I gave the BRI, it was really a lot of fun, and so I look forward to interacting with everyone at the end of my talk. So I want to talk about conflict of interest, and it seems to me that before we can really get into that, we should ask how it fits in with research integrity. My slide won't advance. So one way that we show integrity is really by acknowledging the land that we're on. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And if anyone feels so inclined, you can show your appreciation of these nations by donating at realrentduwamish.org. So, biomedical research integrity. What is integrity? Well, the dictionary definition is twofold. It's the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles, moral uprightness, and the state of being whole and undivided. And so in the talk that I'll give today about conflict of interest, let's keep in mind this definition, especially strong moral principles and the state of being whole and undivided. So what is conflict of interest? It's a situation in which the concerns or aims of two different parties are incompatible. And my thesis today is that talking about conflict of interest is really a bit of a misunderstanding of humanity. That really we should be thinking about conflicts of culture. And that's because human beings all have a shared set of needs, and we're all connected. And so because we're all connected, it's just not possible for me to try to meet my needs at your expense, because if your needs aren't being met and we're so intricately connected, then by definition, my needs aren't going to be met either. And so what I'd like to do is examine where our culture comes from, what really sets culture, and then think about how we can frame conflict of interest really a bit differently in terms of culture to try to make some progress. So the first time I heard the phrase white supremacy culture, I thought, what? It was just a couple years ago, but I'd just never heard it before. And I associated white supremacy with the Ku Klux Klan and other, skinhead extremist groups. But I now recognize that white supremacy culture is a suite of properties that describes our Western culture and explicitly really disconnects us from our humanity. And so here I've listed some of the characteristics of white supremacy culture. This list comes from Dismantling Racism, a workbook for social change groups by Kenneth Jones and Tima Okun. So these include urgency, scarcity, perfectionism. And so what makes these part of white supremacy culture, and why do we think of them now as being bad? Right? Isn't perfectionism good? Don't we all strive to be perfect? Well, scarcity, boy, we really don't have abundant resources in every area. Shouldn't we be conserving our resources? But it turns out that a lot of these concepts, at least in some ways, are pretty maladaptive in our lives and pretty damaging. A lot of the urgency that we work under is really a false urgency that prevents us from enjoying our lives to the fullest, that prevent us from really appreciating the world around us. Competition, another aspect of white supremacy culture, is one that I think a lot about, because when I first came up through the ranks in science, it was believed by pretty much everyone that competition was the way to get to excellence. That only by being pushed to go faster than the other guy would we really get ahead at our fastest rate to our ultimate destination. And in the decades that have passed since I graduated from school, social scientists have done a lot of work to teach us that, in fact, competition is not the best route to excellence, but rather cooperation is. And I know I, for one, really aspire to a world in which we make progress through cooperation by lifting each other up instead of by competition by pushing each other down. So how do these different aspects of white supremacy culture show up in conflict of interest? So it helps, I think, before we get into the specifics of how this plays out in a typical research lab situation, to look at what the opposite of these characteristics are. And these opposites are just thoughts of mine that I've jotted down. There are, of course, many different interpretations to each one of these terms, and each of you might think of a different term that would be the opposite. But for me, urgency is a feeling that makes me want to finish something right away. And so its opposite is really a sense of expansiveness or comprehensiveness. And in a lab situation, I think it might be pretty plain that I would much rather anyway be more comprehensive in my pursuit of science rather than urgent. Scarcity means there aren't enough resources to go around, and scarcity leads to another aspect of white supremacy culture, which is power hoarding. Scarcity means that if you have something, it comes at my expense. And we're brought up with scarcity. We're brought up to see pictures of starving children on television and asked to donate 65 cents a day. We're brought up to see scarcity in other aspects of our lives. And to me, the opposite of scarcity is really abundance. The notion that if we aspire to a world in which everyone's needs are met, in which resources aren't hoarded in the hands of just a few, then we really do exist in a state of abundance. And you can see that there are a lot of other qualities down this list that I don't need to go through because each one of you can think it over and have your own interpretation. But as well, you can put questions in the Q&A, and at the end of my about half hour, 35 minutes of speaking, I hope that we can discuss some of these. So the last one that I want to get to just before I move on is objectivity. As scientists, our core belief system is the scientific method. And in the scientific method, you make observations, develop hypotheses, and then test your hypotheses with experiments. And that cycle, that iteration, is almost dependent on believing that what we're observing is truth. But it turns out that there's really no such thing as objectivity, because we observe what we observe because we ask specific questions. And even the questions that we ask are subjective. And so in Thomas Kuhn's The Nature of Scientific Revolutions, he talks about how we stay in this current paradigm of normal science, in part because of this false belief in objectivity that keeps us tethered to this narrow belief system that also determines the questions that we ask. And there's nothing wrong with normal science. Normal science in which we make incremental improvements on what was known before is a necessary part of the work. But the exciting part of the work, of course, is the paradigm shift. And we all aspire to make paradigm shifting discoveries. And what social sciences are teaching us more and more is that there's nothing like an outsider's perspective to get us to ask different questions. And so to me, the opposite of objectivity is really multiculturalism. Multiculturalism that brings in a diverse set of people with all kinds of different identities who look at the same set of circumstances with different lenses and come up with different questions to ask. So these are some aspects of white supremacy culture and what I view as some of their opposites. How does this play out in the research lab? So I was just thinking over areas in which I've seen conflicts of interest in science labs and came up with 4. This is by no means an exhaustive set, but typical would be opportunities and resources, time, credit, and for students, when to graduate. For postdocs, it might be when to move on. And so how can we use a frame of conflict of culture to understand the conflicts of interest that can come up in these realms? So what are the kinds of opportunities and resources that I'm thinking of? Choice of project, whether to be a specialist or a generalist, writing manuscripts, writing grants, compensation or pay, favoritism, conference travel, a group of really different things. So I just want to start by talking about writing manuscripts. Writing manuscripts is something that for me takes a huge amount of time. And that's in part because writing is thinking. that a lot of the analysis that gets done and the identification of further experiments that need to be done comes somewhere in the process of writing up that work. I'm a principal investigator. I write the grants. I get to determine the research direction. And so doesn't it make sense that I should be the one to write the manuscripts? I think I'm the best writer in my lab, maybe because I've had 30 plus years of experience. Doesn't it make most sense if we're working on deadlines and we have a sense of urgency that I should be the one to write those? Well, that's a conflict of interest because my trainees' interest is being mentored in how to write. They also want to get out the paper, that's shared. They want the paper to get out sooner rather than later, that's shared. But who does the work is a conflict of interest. My interest is getting the work out as quickly as I can in as wonderful a form as it can be. And my trainees' interest is in getting experience with writing and improving their skills. So if I look at the world through a white supremacist culture lens, where things are urgent, where my grant deadlines are coming up, where I'm worried about being scooped, if I look at the world with that urgency lens, then the scales are going to tip and I'm going to do more of the writing. But if instead I step back and say, you know what, this scientific endeavor is going to take more than just my lifetime. It's been going on for millennia and it will continue for millennia. That no one's life depends on whether this comes out in 2 weeks or 2 months. The important thing is to get the work right and to provide the training for the next generation to recognize that if they don't get that training, if they don't have that opportunity, then things might get done faster now, but they're going to slow down in the long run when people in training now have to do writing for the first time on their own when they're in more advanced positions. Then I'll recognize that in fact, our interests are actually more balanced than might at first seem. So let's take another one. So favoritism. It's, I think, a pretty common issue that comes up in labs that principal investigators might mostly unconsciously send resources and opportunities to some people more than to others. So you might think, well, of course I'm going to send my work as a PI. I'm going to give the best projects to the best people because I want these projects to succeed because the taxpayers' funds are going to support this work and the taxpayer deserves excellence. But that's really a false dichotomy between getting done and not getting done. And if you think of the people who we typically view as the best, they fit into a pretty standard demographic. Not just demographic, but they tend to be neurotypical, they tend to be extroverted, they tend to be white, they tend to be male. And by shunting work primarily in the direction of people who look like we do, we generate clones of ourselves. We don't give the opportunity to people who may think about things a little bit differently, might look a little bit different, they might run their personal lives a little bit differently, they might come from less advantaged backgrounds, but it's those outsiders who are more likely to have the paradigm shifting ideas. And so we might think that favoritism is adaptive for PIs because PIs have an eye for quality. But in fact, what we really have an eye for is people who look just like us, is for the traditional definition of success, which inevitably is going to make science go at a slower pace overall, rather than a more inclusive approach that shares opportunities with a broader group and increases the number of people who have the opportunities to come up with those paradigm shifting ideas. So time. We touched a little bit on time. I can tell you that writing papers in which my trainees are at the center, where they're really exercising that learn to write muscle is a lot more time consuming for me than just writing it myself. But there's also other kinds of conflicts of time. My trainees sometimes want to do things other than science. Wow, they want to work not just at the bench, but they want to have a home life. They want to work in science policy. They want to be active in the union. They want to have outside interests. And you might think again that my interest as a PI would be to have them chained to the bench. In the School of Medicine, because we have a very big clinical side, I can tell you that physician burnout is a huge issue. It's much less recognized in the basic science side, but I've seen anecdotally many people burn out and leave the traditional scientific path because they're being asked to devote too much of their life to work. And it's just not healthy for any of us to not have interests outside. I know that I have 4 children and have been married for 32 years and have 3 labradoodles. And I can have a much more sustainable research career because I have that strong home foundation to support me. I'm also a somewhat more interesting person because I spend life outside the lab. I don't want to fool you into thinking I'm a very interesting person. I'm really not, but at least a somewhat more interesting person with some interests outside what happens. And because of that, I interact with a greater variety of people. And again, that cross-pollination of ideas can accelerate our thinking in research. So less burnout, cross-pollination of ideas, and better mental health. So again, we might think of it as a conflict of interest where PIs benefit when trainees spend every moment at the bench. But as a scientific enterprise, we know that the folks who do that tend to burn out and tend to not be able to sustain their efforts in the long term. When to publish is another big area of conflict of interest. And this one isn't so much between PIs and trainees, although there is some of that. A long time ago, when I was in graduate school, there was the concept of least publishable unit. And that was a pejorative term that meant that people wanted to have a large number of publications. And so they would split up what should be one story into multiple little stories, each of which would be its own paper. Things have swung in the opposite direction at this point, where team science is discussed as very important, and a paper needs to be really big and important to get published in a high-profile journal. So what that means is that a given high-profile paper might have hundreds of person hours with work spread across numerous research groups doing numerous techniques. And that's really suboptimal for the community because it means that we don't see the result of the work really until the end. It's also suboptimal for the people participating in the work, for the trainees especially, because they have fewer opportunities to be lead author, they have fewer opportunities to actually write the manuscript, and they have fewer opportunities to be in a leadership role in determining what the story actually is. Of course, credit. We have conflicts of interest around credit. I did this and should be last author. No, I did this and should be last author. And there are treatises written giving formulas over how to determine authorship order based on number of panels per figure, number of figures per paper, who contributed what experiments. And if we look at things with a lens of scarcity, that there's only so much credit to go around, then sure, authorship is an area in which we're going to have conflict. If we look at things with a lens of competition, yeah, who's first and who's last is important. But if we can figure out how to shift our frame to instead value the work itself. If we value the work itself, then we can start to think about credit as something to be shared among many rather than hoarded by a few. Now, I know that this ideal world that I'm talking about isn't really helpful today to trainees who are in labs where they're not getting the appropriate credit for their work. And I recognize that. I also recognize that those of you on this webinar who are trainees, you're the next generation. You're the ones who are going to be empowered next. And so this way of shifting our frame of reference from scarcity to abundance, from competition to cooperation, it has a rough transition. And people are suffering during this time of rough transition. And we need to find other ways to support people who are getting screwed. But it's also important to remember that one day, those of you who don't have power and influence will have power of influence. And now is the time to start thinking about what you want your world to look like. So the last area I want to talk about is when to graduate. I think of myself as a pretty good mentor. I value training of the people in my lab over my own personal success. It's actually more important to me. But not too long ago, I found myself making the wrong choice because of a conflict of interest. I had a graduate student who was clearly outstanding, had been very productive, and really wasn't learning anything from me anymore. This student was ready to be out on their own. And we talked about plans of when to graduate, and we talked about, you know, let's have you finish this paper. It's almost done, and if you have that paper under your belt, then, you know, it'll be so much better when you go to the next thing. And we met with her committee. The committee didn't have the same conflict of interest as me. My interest was making sure the student did the work before they left. But the committee was better able to look at the whole picture. And they asked the question, student, why don't you graduate now and then finish the work? And as soon as they said that, I recognized how my thinking had been clouded by my conflict of interest, by my thinking about myself, putting myself in the center rather than what was best for the students. And so conflict of interest happens between PIs and trainees, even when there are very good intentions. In fact, conflict of interests happen mostly when we have good intentions. When we have evil intentions, then things tend to get caught. But our good intentions instead tend to mask what we're trying to do. They tend to mask, oh, I'm thinking about the student. I'm not thinking about myself. And when I fool myself into thinking that that's the case, it's much easier to get away with that kind of conflict of interest. So urgency versus comprehensiveness clearly goes into when someone should graduate. Perfectionism versus appreciation for what people have already done. Quantity versus quality. All of these aspects of white supremacy culture and their opposites can be weighed when we think about when to graduate and can create apparent conflicts of interest between trainees and PIs. So I want to spend the next few minutes talking about where all of this comes from and what we can do about it. So I would argue that the root cause of conflict is our culture. And if the root cause of these conflicts is our culture, then we should be asking, what sets our culture? What is culture? So organizational culture has been described mostly in the business context, but I think it applies to academia as well. And it has 5 different components. Vision. What are we trying to accomplish here? What's our goal? So the vision of the School of Medicine, the vision statement, is to improve the health of the public. It's that simple, to improve the health of the public. And based on that vision, we have to decide how to implement it. And we implement it based on our values. So we talk about what we value, we talk about what's important to us and what our priorities are. Based on those values, we develop sets of practices to help make sure that our values get carried out in real life. And we hire the right people, right in quotation marks. We hire people who are able to work within the structures that we set up and who should be able to thrive within our culture. And finally, the physical space. Do we put people in little cubby holes? Do we bring people together? How do we set up our physical space? So these are the 5 different aspects that go into determining an organizational culture. So now that we know this, what can we do about it to help shape that culture? One thing that we can do, and that we don't do nearly often enough, is just talk about our visions and our values. And what I mean by this is that each and every one of you in your own research spaces can try to lead discussions, participating discussions of what is our vision. A lot of times for PIs, the vision can be found on their specific aims page, but sometimes their vision is broader than that. You know, it's the answer to the question of what do you want the meaning of your life to be when you're sitting in the rocking chair in your retirement, looking back over your years? What to you looks like accomplishment? And I can tell you, for me, it's found a little bit in my specific aims pages. I want to advance our understanding of inflammatory pain, but the bigger part of it is in the legacy of the people that I've trained. What I value, what I want to look back on, is a record of training people who are fulfilled human beings and who bring science out into the community in a way that's meaningful to them. That's it. I've thought about my vision, that's my vision. And if I talk about it with the people in my lab, then I give them the opportunity to share in that vision, to influence the vision. But if I keep it to myself, then I don't. So you have a vision, you talk about what your values are, and once you've done that, you can review the practices and see whether they're in alignment with your vision and your values. So in my group, that came up quite vividly in the undergraduates that were working in the lab. So I've always had, 1 or 2 undergraduates working in the lab, and sure enough, they tended to be young people who came from privileged backgrounds. And it took me a while to come to terms with the fact that that wasn't an accident, that if I was bringing in young people from privileged backgrounds, it wasn't because they were the only ones out there. It was because I must be doing something to select them. And so I changed the way I recruited undergraduates. I started with a transparent mechanism, which was a persistence test. And I told the prospective students that if they kept coming back to me to talk about the readings that I gave them, then they would be welcomed into the lab eventually. That all they had to do was persist. And when that happened, first of all, I had a lot more undergraduates who wanted to work with me, but they also were coming from a much more varied set of backgrounds. Students would be coming from community college, they'd be coming from different majors, they'd be coming from different parts of the state, and it was a much more enjoyable place to be in my lab. It gave the lab a real sense of joie de vivre, to have this diverse group of people who really wanted to be there, who might not otherwise have the opportunity, because maybe instead of devoting their entire time to studying so that they could get straight A's, they also work 25 hours a week to help put themselves through school. So review your practices to make sure that they align with your values. Hire the right people, we just talked about that, and consider the physical space as a reflection of and a contribution to your culture. In our physical spaces, we don't always have a lot of choice, but we do have some choice. And it may be things as simple as putting up photos of lab alumni with their families, putting up photos of members of the lab in their free time, looking at different ways that you can make the space feel welcoming to those around you. So I want to just now talk about one more thing, which is that relationships contribute to productivity. So I'm talking a lot about culture, and I recognize it's a bit of an uphill battle because I'm talking about culture to people who have less power. But again, part of why I'm doing this is because I'm trying to convince you that as the next generation's power brokers, you can start to have a big change now. So one of the things that you can do to build culture is to develop something called a colleague map. And all a colleague map really does is help you build relationships. Most of you are probably not as socially awkward as I am, but I'm pretty socially awkward. And when I first came into the lab, I put my nose to the grindstone, I did my lab work, and I didn't really know how to build those networks and connections. So there are resources online, I've listed one here at the bottom, of questions that you can ask to help develop a colleague map. Personal questions: how do you get to work? What do you do on the weekend? What's something new and exciting in your life? And professional questions: how is your project going? I noticed you were at the meeting last week. What's up? And again, for those of you who aren't as awkward as I've been, you might not need this kind of cheat sheet, but taking some time every day to put into those relationships with people that you have in the workplace can help you develop a network of people to support you when times are rough, to celebrate you when times are great, and to work together, to collaborate, to build a better culture. So that's about as much time as I wanted to talk about. I just want to end with a reminder that conflict of interest is defined as a situation in which the concerns or aims of two parties are incompatible, and hope that you'll start to think about whether in a world in which we are all really connected to our own humanity and the humanity of others, whether it's really ever possible for there truly to be a conflict of interest, or whether that apparent conflict of interest is really arising from our pathological white supremacy culture that is designed to separate us from who we are and from the humanity of others. And that it's an important question because the solutions are different depending on whether you think conflict of interest really arises from incompatible interests or from a toxic culture. If conflict of interest really is because two people have different interests, then it's all about mediating between those interests. Whereas if conflict of interest is more a product of our culture, then the long-term solution is really to work on our culture. And so with that, I will stop the screen share and hand it over to Karen to bring up any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Sharona. That was a really interesting talk, very thought-provoking, very compelling. Thinking there's a lot of people who can create their own vision for what they want the research enterprise to be in the future. We do have a couple of questions, some of which have been upvoted significantly. So let's start with the most upvoted one. This comes from an anonymous person. It says, while I agree that in an ideal world, the mindset should be abundance over scarcity and competitiveness should be valued less, how do we reconcile these values with the current funding and job landscape of science, which both serve to promote competitiveness and are inherently scarce? It seems to me that encouraging individuals to adopt these mindsets can only go so far, and that fundamental change cannot occur until our institutions change first.
I'm not going to disagree with that. I think that there are realities that are hard realities. For example, I might say I don't want a world in which we think about urgency, but a grant deadline is a grant deadline, and they don't change the deadline just because I want culture to change. So what I'm really arguing is that we start talking about this more. I think it's really not so different from how I think about the kind of culture change we need to end sexism and to end racism, which is that we need both top-down and bottom-up changes. We need our institutions to change, but we also need to recognize that culture is the everyday interactions between people and change that too. And so my hope is that this is a message of empowerment. You know what? Most people who are listening to this are trainees and do not have the power to change the institution on any kind of rapid time scale. But you do have the power to contribute to culture change in your immediate sphere on a rapid time scale. And so if you can start to tap into that power, you can make a difference for the people that you interact with every day. And that might mean just asking them to question when they're down and out and didn't get a resource. You know, is this the world we want to live in? Let's imagine a more ideal world. And maybe that conversation will buoy their spirits a little bit to make it through. But yeah, no, I get it. I don't have a magic wand.
Thanks, Sharona. And maybe the attendees can think about their own philosophy and how they want that philosophy to represent a world that is different from what it is now in terms of their group or lab philosophy moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Part of what diversity and inclusion means is that we don't all have the same vision, and that sharing our different visions with each other is a mechanism for growth for all of us.
Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, the next question. Even if a laboratory or group decides to equitably share credit, for example, with regard to authorship, the rest of the research world still values first author publications in high impact journals. How should we manage these different norms or expectations? It's rather similar to the last question.
Yeah, so one way that has been addressed is a not very satisfying one of having co-first authors. Mm-hmm. You know, let's face it, it's better than nothing, but there's still only one first author. One approach to that is thinking about whether the paper needs to be as big as it is. But really, the answer to that is a long-term one found in the San Francisco Declaration of Research Assessment, the DORA, which talks about how in this better world that we imagine, we read the paper and we evaluate what was actually done instead of looking at where it was published as the proxy for quality. And that's not going to happen overnight. But again, talking about these issues and making sure that each of us, to the extent that we can, is living our own values will, I believe, accelerate the coming of that better world.
Thank you. Another question is, you mentioned the persistence test and that it's helped increase the quantity and diversity of undergraduates in your lab. Can you tell us more about how that works for you? And then in parentheses, how frequently do you discuss papers with these prospective undergrads, and how many papers do you typically discuss with them before you invite them into the lab?
Yes, that's a great question. So what I've done in the past is just put up an ad in the undergraduate research site, and I typically get 50 or so responses, and then I hold information sessions. And in these information sessions, I'm mostly giving a spiel about what research is, and I tell people if they're still interested to contact me. And so that's the first test, that do they contact me again? And I tell them, again, if you keep coming back, then you will be able to work in the lab. And then when I meet with them one-on-one, I really have to assess what their background is and what they know. And I will give them readings starting basic, like with Wikipedia, to pretty advanced. And typically they either drop away or engage within, I'd say, half a quarter, maybe 5-6 weeks. And so in that 5-6 weeks, I would probably meet with those who are interested 3, maybe 4 times. And, you know, if I put up an ad and get 50 people and end up with, you know, 8 to 10, that means that most people weren't really that interested, or weren't interested enough to keep coming back. But those who do keep coming back are a much more diverse group.
How do you find the time to meet with all those people?
Yeah, I don't know. You know, prioritizing your time, that's one of my values. And it is, to some extent, the conflict of urgency versus comprehensiveness, of scarcity versus abundance. Time is a zero-sum game. I guess the real answer is that I work too hard and I go to see my therapist to recharge and make sure that what I'm doing is sustainable.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, the next question. Do you know a current PI who prioritized their work-life balance during graduate school or during their postdoc?
Yes, yes, I do. I know current PIs who will announce, I'm going home to get my kids. Now, let's face it, I don't really know how people prioritize something, right? I'm making assumptions. One of the lessons that I've learned in life is that you never really know what is going on with someone's life. But I do know PIs who appear to be really invested in their home life. And for some people, their home life is partner and kids. For other people, their home life is some sort of activism. For others, it's a sport. And, you know, there's no judgment in that. We each find our path where we find it, and they're all valid. Are those PIs less successful? In the traditional terms, sure. You know what? I'm less successful. My lab group is never bigger than 5 or 6 people. I've never published a paper in a Nature journal, but I was co-author on a paper. But I, in the last more than decade, will only submit papers to nonprofit scientist-run journals. And does that make me less successful? Yeah, but it's sustainable, so I'm happy with it.
So what about for those PIs or any of the PIs, did they achieve work-life balance during graduate school or postdoc? I mean, it's one thing too, once you achieve being a professor.
Okay, yeah, no, so that's, yeah. When you are less in the driver's seat for making decisions, it's more challenging. And, you know, my experience might not be typical, but I had a child in graduate school, a child as a postdoc, a child as an assistant professor, and a child as an associate professor. And did I ever have balance? No, I never had balance. What's balance? I still don't have balance. What I have is a feeling that I'm not doing as good a job as I want to do in every single sector of my life. And that's what I call balance. And again, checking in with my mental health therapist is critical to making that feel good for me. But there are times when it hasn't felt good for me. There are times when it's felt pretty lousy. And no one is at 100% of their game all the time. It's just a fact. So the question is, what do you do when your PI isn't supportive of that? And, you know, that's hard. I don't have a simple answer to that. It's rely on your network to support you in doing what you know is right. Sometimes it means making compromises that don't align with your values in the short term. That's really why we need to change the culture, so that no one should have to make those kinds of choices.
Yeah, I think it's really important to at the stage where you are choosing your grad student school PI, thesis advisor or choosing your postdoc mentor, if you know you're going to have children or you know that you love to go rock climbing every weekend, to choose those labs wisely. And it's not the first question you ask, but it's got to be a question you ask because the expectations have to meet. As ombuds at the Fred Hutch, I deal with when expectations don't meet, and that can get really messy.
Yeah, so I think that's another reason to talk about your vision and your values, right? Because if your vision and your values as a trainee don't align with those of your PI, it's probably not going to be a great relationship. Another thing I'd say is that in my experience, when there's an issue of a trainee's productivity, it's never about the time that they're putting in, right? There's a different problem. It may manifest as the time, but there's always some other way in which they're not getting the support they need or where there's mismatched expectations.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. Let's see. There are a lot of really comments that are they love your talk. Let's see, I'm trying to get to a question. Okay, so do you have any comments on the ways that conflicts of culture may lead to questionable research practices that contribute to research misconduct?
Yeah, absolutely. So other questions have really brought out the fact that the incentives that we have these days in science favor quantity over quality, favor urgency over expansiveness and comprehensiveness. And I think that when there's been some kind of research misconduct, it can sometimes look like the PI telling people, produce this result no matter what, and getting it. Or it can look like the trainees questioning the PI and not being given the space to really explore their concerns. Those kinds of areas of research misconduct are one where I believe dialogue is incredibly useful, because what looks like research misconduct might be wishful thinking. But boy, I would rather have that research misconduct caught at an early stage than wait till it comes out later. In fact, the intentions don't really matter. We are all on the same team of wanting science to have integrity and be its best. And so all of us need to figure out how to live with being questioned and to having our work questioned and to being asked, you know, show me. Don't just tell me, but show me.
Awesome, thank you. How do you deal with intercompetitiveness between grad students or postdocs? There's a postdoc in my lab who seems to be insecure about his project and takes it out on me.
Yeah, so I wish that I've done recently trainings in nonviolent communication, which is a philosophy of life and a form of communication that's really premised on this idea that we're all connected. And the founder, you know, Marshall Rosenberg in the 1970s, he talked about how he would go into groups where, you know, there were rival gangs who literally hated each other and see their needs instead of their words and be able to mediate compromises. I don't have those skills, or they're very nascent, and I don't think most of us can expect to really have those skills. I think what we need to do in those situations is seek allies to both talk it through with us and to coach us. That going through it alone is really the problem. If somebody's being competitive and you don't have anyone to support you, to empathize with you, you know, it's going to be a lot harder to get through.
Thank you. So this is one that she's Huda Ben Habib. I wish all leaders are present today. I really appreciate all of what you said. How can we change all this if we can't reach a position of authority?
So the assumption of that question is that if you live your values, then you're not going to be able to accumulate power. And there's some truth to that. But I don't buy the assumption that if you live your values, you won't accumulate enough power to make a difference. Our institution is hierarchical, our institution is patriarchal. It is built that way, it was designed that way, and we can't escape that. On the other hand, the institution is no more than a collection of humans. And even if just 10% of those humans are share your values and are willing to talk about them, then you do have some people's ears. I would say that a more difficult, well, I don't want to make a judgment here, but another difficult issue is that trainees are really busy and have a lot of responsibility, and that for too long we've been putting the burden of culture change on the backs of those who are most vulnerable. And it really is time for those with more power to step up and to take some of that burden on our own shoulders. And you know what? I see that happening. It's not happening in droves, but it is happening. I've talked to a lot of people. You know, Karen is one of them. Malia, who runs this, is one of them. Melissa is a UW ally in the Allies program, Melissa Cox. And so there are people who want to support you. And now I'm talking to the trainees. There are people who want to support you in getting your voice heard, who want to amplify your voices. So lean on them.
Thanks. Okay. I just want to make sure things haven't been voted up. All right. Okay, here's one. If I have a financial interest in a device or a drug, doing research on that might be a conflict of interest. What are the guidelines for research in this situation? And then an additional question, and what does racism or sexism have to do with any of this?
So there are explicit guidelines, you know, both on the Hutch website and the UW website. And the major take-home message for those kinds of conflict of interest is to declare them. That there are some things you're not allowed to do, but there's a big range of things you are allowed to do if they're transparent. And so just make sure that you read those and follow those. And I wonder if the question is trying to get at the relationship between the common conflicts of interest, the interpersonal conflicts of interest that we're experiencing in labs, and these financial conflicts of interest. And I do think that there is a connection in that situations that incentivize integrity will have fewer financial conflicts of interest. But I don't have data to back that up.
All right, we have 2 more minutes and another question. How can we make sure that the people who don't invest in toxic norms and can change things for the better don't get pushed out before they can make the biggest changes? This applies to DEI work as well. The fact is that hiring committees don't value DEI work as much as, say, getting another paper, even when improving diversity may take as much work as getting that paper and go just as far in improving the quality of science. How can we convince people with power that these things ought to be valued?
Yeah, so I think that this person actually answered their question, right? There were 2 answers. So how do we make sure that the people who have strong values are going to be able to be around long enough to get something done? And how do we make sure that on the other side, the people making the decisions about who gets to stick around are evaluating the right things? In the School of Medicine, at least 6 different graduate programs, students wrote letters to their program directors and faculty saying, look guys, things here aren't good enough. That the senior generation has dropped the ball on improving our culture. And here are some ideas that we'd like to see discussed and implemented. And so collectively expressing your voices is one way to do that. Making sure that, I mean, it's great to also speak individually, but having the opportunity to speak together as a group can really amplify voices. And that really does matter. It does influence the hiring committees. It does influence the faculty making admissions decisions for who gets into the programs.
Thanks. I think I can also speak to this at the Fred Hutch. All of our search committees have and or will be receiving DEI training. And one of our co-directors of our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion is a faculty member, and he is influencing faculty hiring as well. He's directly responsible for making sure that faculty hiring is unbiased.
Yeah, and you know, I can say that I talked about implicit bias training for the last maybe 8 years. And when I first started talking about it with search committees, I got eye rolls. And nowadays people get it.
Yeah.
Maybe not everybody, but a lot of people do get it. And so things are changing.
I agree. I'm hopeful.
Yeah.
Let's see. It's 1 minute after the hour, so I'm afraid we're going to have to end there. Thank you so much, Sharona. I really appreciate your talk, and again, incredibly thought-provoking and a great vision to pull us towards a better future. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for coming.